The star system, known to the local inhabitants as Kalo 4, was a chaotic mess of high-energy radiation and jagged orbital debris, a place where no sensible biological entity would ever choose to set down roots. It was precisely because of this inhospitable nature that the coalition of unified sovereign systems had chosen it as the primary shipyard for their latest generation of dreadnoughts. The coalition, a conglomerate of 13 distinct species who prided themselves on their elegance, their biological purity, and their mastery over the fundamental forces of the universe, had long considered themselves the pinnacle of existence. They moved through the galaxy with a grace that bordered on the divine, their ships constructed from shimmering lattices of solidified light and reinforced by exotic matter that defied the standard laws of physics. To the coalition, the universe was a garden to be pruned, and they were the master gardeners. They had spent millennia perfecting their craft, ensuring that every world they touched was brought into a state of harmonious perfection. However, this harmony was currently being threatened by a force that they could neither understand nor easily classify. Deep within the shifting nebula of the Kalo system, a small, unremarkable vessel had appeared on the long-range sensors of the Coalition's primary defense platform. It was not a ship of light or exotic matter. It was a crude, boxy construction of heavy metals and rudimentary fusion reactors. It lacked the sleek curves of a Vexian cruiser or the shimmering translucence of a Siderian scout. Instead, it was a hulking mass of pitted armor plating and exposed conduits, venting gases with a rhythmic chuffing sound that reminded the Coalition monitors of a dying beast. This was a human vessel, a remnant of a species that the Coalition had largely ignored for centuries. The humans were seen as a developmental dead end, a race that had achieved spaceflight through sheer, stubborn refusal to die on their own gravity well of a planet. They used chemical thrusters and solid-state electronics, technologies that the Coalition had discarded before they had even mastered fire. To the observers on the defense platform, the human ship was an eyesore, a primitive relic that had somehow wandered into a construction zone far beyond its capabilities. Doctorate holder Vaxin, a senior administrator of the Coalition's logistical wing, watched the sensor feed with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The human ship, identified by its transponder as the Steadfast, was broadcasting a low-frequency radio signal, a method of communication so outdated that it required the station's archives to be manually searched for a compatible receiver. When the message was finally decoded, it was not a plea for help or a declaration of war. It was a request for docking rights and a manifest of trade goods. Vaxin found the idea laughable. What could these biological oddities possibly offer a civilization that could synthesize gold from vacuum energy and weave armor from the very fabric of spacetime? The humans offered raw ores, hand-machined mechanical components, and a variety of fermented biological compounds they referred to as spirits. It was like a caveman offering a sharpened stick to a soldier armed with a railgun. Vaxin prepared to issue a formal denial and an order for the Steadfast to vacate the system immediately, but he was interrupted by a notification from the shipyard's engineering deck. The shipyard was currently facing a crisis that their advanced technology could not solve. One of the primary stabilizing rings for the new dreadnought, a massive structure composed of hyperdense alloys, had suffered a microscopic fracture during the cooling process. Under normal circumstances, the Coalition would simply use molecular rewelders to seal the gap, but the fracture was located deep within a region of intense gravitational flux, where their precision tools were being rendered useless. The exotic matter that formed the tools was reacting poorly to the local fluctuations, causing the rewelders to fluctuate out of phase with the material they were meant to repair. If the fracture was not sealed within the next 72 hours, the entire ring would shatter, potentially destroying the shipyard and delaying the dreadnought's completion by decades. Vaxen's engineers were at a loss. Their methods relied on perfection and high-energy manipulation, and when the environment became too chaotic for their delicate instruments, they were paralyzed. It was at this moment that Vaxen looked back at the manifest of the Steadfast and noticed a specific entry: high-pressure thermal lances and manual kinetic welding units. Vaxen hesitated, his pride warring with the cold reality of the situation. He reached out to the human vessel, his voice projected through the archaic radio link. He explained the situation with a condescending tone, assuming the humans would be overwhelmed by the complexity of the task. He told them of the gravitational flux, the hyperdense alloy, and the precision required to prevent a catastrophic failure. The response from the Steadfast was immediate and unexpectedly casual. A human named Miller, whose voice sounded like gravel being ground in a mortar, told Vaxen that they had dealt with worse while mining the asteroid belts of their home system. Miller claimed that their tools didn't care about gravitational flux because they were built on the principle of hitting things until they stayed put. Vaxen was skeptical, but with no other options, he granted the Steadfast permission to approach the shipyard. He watched as the human vessel maneuvered with a surprising degree of agility, using small, violent bursts of gas to orient itself against the swirling debris of the nebula. When the human crew finally arrived at the fracture site, the Coalition engineers watched from behind the safety of their reinforced observation ports. The humans were encased in bulky, ungainly pressurized suits that looked like they belonged in a museum of early industrial history. They didn't use grav tethers or inertial dampeners. Instead, they used physical cables and magnetic boots to secure themselves to the vibrating surface of the stabilizing ring. Miller, leading the team, carried a device that looked more like a weapon than a tool. It was a massive, handheld thermal lance that roared with a brilliant, dirty orange flame. Vaxen gasped as he saw the humans begin to work. They weren't using molecular scanners to map the fracture, they were using their hands to feel the vibrations in the metal. They were shouting at each other through short-range radio, their language filled with technical jargon and colorful metaphors that the Coalition's translation software struggled to process. The work was brutal and dangerous. The gravitational flux caused the ring to twist and groan, sending shudders through the structure that would have shattered the delicate frames of most Coalition species. The humans, however, seemed to thrive in the chaos. When the flux spiked, they simply braced themselves, their heavy suits absorbing the impact. They began to apply the thermal lance to the fracture, the intense heat melting the hyperdense alloy in a way that the Coalition's precision tools never could. They were literally forcing the metal back together, using kinetic hammers to beat the molten edges into a seamless bond. It was a display of raw, physical power and stubborn persistence that left the Coalition observers speechless. They watched as the humans worked for hours without rest, their movements coordinated and efficient despite the primitive nature of their equipment. There was a rhythm to their labor, a steady pulse of hammering and venting that echoed through the hull of the shipyard. As the final hours of the deadline approached, the fracture began to close. The humans were covered in metallic dust and grime, their suits scorched by the heat of the lance. Miller called out a final instruction, and the crew initiated a cooling sequence using a high-pressure spray of liquid nitrogen. The sudden change in temperature caused the metal to contract with a sound like a thunderclap, but the bond held. The stabilizing ring was whole once again. Vaxen could hardly believe the sensor readings. The repair was not as elegant as a molecular weld, and the surface was scarred and uneven, but it was structurally sound. In fact, the repaired section was now denser and more resilient than the rest of the ring. The humans had not just fixed the problem, they had reinforced it through sheer force of will. Miller contacted the defense platform, his voice sounding tired but satisfied. He asked if there was anything else they needed or if they could get on with the trade. Vaxin found himself unable to maintain his previous air of superiority. He authorized the trade, offering the humans a far greater exchange rate than he had originally intended. As the Steadfast prepared to depart, Vaxin watched the crude vessel on his screen. He realized that the coalition had spent so long seeking perfection that they had forgotten the value of resilience. They had built their civilization on the assumption that the universe would eventually submit to their logic and their light. The humans, on the other hand, lived in a universe that they knew was hostile and indifferent. They didn't wait for the environment to become perfect. They adapted their tools and themselves to survive in the mess. As the human ship vanished into the depths of the nebula, leaving behind a trail of chemical exhaust, Vaxin felt a strange sense of foreboding. He wondered if the Coalition's dreadnoughts, for all their advanced technology, would ever be as enduring as the unrefined iron of the Steadfast. The human ship, the Steadfast, drifted slowly away from the shipyard, its engines glowing with a dull, persistent heat. Inside, the crew was already moving on to the next task. They weren't celebrating their success or dwelling on the awe of the Coalition. To them, it was just another job in a long line of jobs that kept their ship running and their bellies full. They were a people who had been forged in the fires of a harsh solar system, and they carried that hardness with them wherever they went. They didn't need the validation of advanced species, and they didn't care for the aesthetics of light and symmetry. They cared about what worked, what lasted, and what could be fixed with a hammer and a bit of ingenuity. Miller sat in the pilot's chair, staring out at the stars, already thinking about the next system and the next opportunity to trade their skills for the resources they needed to keep moving. The galaxy was a big, messy place, and there was always room for a bit of unrefined iron. The transition from the Kalo system to the fringe territories of the Holthari sovereignty was a grueling trek that tested the mechanical endurance of the Steadfast and the mental fortitude of its occupants. While the Coalition lived in the gilded centers of the galaxy, the Holthari occupied the jagged edges, where stars were sparse and the vacuum felt particularly cold. The Holthari were a species of crystalline biology, their bodies reflecting the harsh ultraviolet light of their binary suns, and their culture was built upon the rigid mathematics of structural integrity. They did not value the aesthetics of the Coalition, nor did they possess the gritty adaptability of the humans. They valued permanence. To a Holthari, a building, a ship, or a treaty should last for 10,000 years without a single modification. When the Steadfast crossed into their space, it was not met with curiosity or condescension, but with a cold, analytical scrutiny that measured the human vessel against the Holthari's exacting standards of geometric perfection. The humans were here because the Holthari had run into a problem that their perfect mathematics could not account for: the unpredictable nature of biological rot within their deep space atmospheric processes. The processes were massive, rotating cylinders that converted frozen methane and ammonia from the moons of gas giants into breathable air for the subterranean Holthari cities. These machines were marvels of engineering, designed to run for millennia with zero maintenance. However, an invasive species of fungal spores, carried on the hull of an automated freighter from a distant sector, had found a way to thrive within the humid, pressurized interior of the processes. The fungus did not eat the metal. It grew in thick, rubbery mats that clogged the intake valves and fouled the precision sensors. The Holthari attempted to purge the systems using radiation, sonic vibrations, and chemical agents, but the fungus adapted with a frightening speed, forming calcified shells that shielded the core of the growth. Because the Holthari designed everything to be permanent and tamper-proof, they had no way to manually enter the processes without compromising the structural integrity of the entire atmospheric system. They were trapped by their own obsession with stability, watching as their air supply slowly dwindled while their perfect machines hummed uselessly behind armored bulkheads. Miller stood in the cramped cargo bay of the Steadfast, inspecting a series of specialized pressurized suits that the crew had modified for this specific contract. These weren't the standard EVA suits used at the Kalo shipyard. These were reinforced with layers of acid-resistant polymer and equipped with high-torque mechanical scrapers. Beside him, a crew member named Sarah was checking the fuel levels on a set of portable flamethrowers. The Holthari had been horrified when the humans suggested using fire inside a pressurized, oxygen-rich environment, but Miller had explained that the alternative was a slow death by suffocation. The humans understood something the Holthari didn't. Sometimes you have to break the rules of the system to save the system itself. The Holthari representative, a being of translucent blue quartz named Coranth, watched the preparations through a video link, its voice a series of melodic pings and clicks translated into flat, toneless speech. Coranth expressed concern that the human methods were violent and lacked the necessary precision to ensure the long-term viability of the processes. The Steadfast docked with the primary atmospheric hub, a structure the size of a small moon that hung in the shadow of a massive, ringside gas giant. The hum of the station was wrong. It was a low, stuttering vibration instead of the smooth, musical resonance that the Holthari preferred. Miller led a team of 4 into the primary access airlock, which the Holthari had been forced to cut open using industrial lasers, a move that Coranth had described as a tragedy of the highest order. As the inner doors groaned open, the humans were met with a wall of thick, pungent air that smelled of damp earth and decaying vegetation. The fungus was everywhere, hanging from the ceiling in long, gray tendrils and coating the walls in a slick, black slime. It pulsed with a faint, sickly bioluminescence that provided the only light in the cavernous intake chamber. The Holthari sensors had reported the growth, but they hadn't captured the sheer, suffocating weight of it. It felt less like a machine and more like the interior of a massive, diseased lung. The humans didn't hesitate. Sarah fired the first burst from her flamethrower, a jet of concentrated chemical fire that cut through the darkness and incinerated a cluster of hanging tendrils. The fungus didn't just burn, it screamed, a high-pitched venting of internal gases that echoed through the metallic corridors. The Holthari observers on the comms channel fell silent, likely processing the sheer brutality of the human approach. Miller and the others moved forward with their scrapers, peeling back the calcified mats of growth to reveal the intricate Holthari machinery beneath. It was slow, back-breaking work. Every square inch of the processor had to be cleared by hand because the Holthari had never designed the system to be cleaned. The humans were working in a nightmare of heat, noise, and toxic fumes, their physical bodies pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. While the Holthari looked at the problem as a mathematical error to be solved, the humans looked at it as a trench to be dug. By the second day of the operation, the team was exhausted. The fungus seemed to grow back almost as fast as they could clear it, feeding on the very nutrients the humans brought in on their suits. Miller realized that the traditional purging methods were failing because the spores were hiding in the microscopic pores of the Holthari alloy. He ordered the team to stop the burning and instead began a process of salting the walls. They used a mixture of industrial cleaning agents and abrasive metallic grit, scrubbing the surfaces until the polished Holthari metal was scratched and dull. Coranth's voice crackled over the radio, filled with a sound that could only be described as crystalline anguish. The Holthari official begged Miller to stop damaging the finish of the intake valves, claiming that the loss of structural smoothness would decrease the efficiency of the airflow by 0.03%. Miller ignored him. He knew that the 0.03% didn't matter if the entire population of the planet below was gasping for air. The struggle continued for another 3 days. The humans worked in shifts, sleeping in the airlock and eating tasteless nutrient paste while their muscles cramped and their lungs burned from the lingering fumes. They encountered pockets of the fungus that had evolved to produce corrosive spores that ate through the outer layers of their suits, requiring frantic patch jobs with heavy-duty tape in the middle of a clearing operation. There was no glory in this work, no grand tactical maneuvers or displays of high technology. It was just humans in the dark, fighting a biological tide with fire and steel. Yet there was a grim satisfaction in it. They were doing what the Holthari could not. They were being messy, they were being loud, and they were being effective. They were the friction in a galaxy that desperately wanted to be frictionless. Finally, the heartbeat of the station changed. As the last of the fungal mats were cleared from the primary intake fan, the massive blades began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The roar of the wind began to drown out the sound of the scrapers. The air in the chamber cleared, sucked out into the filtration system where the Holthari's remaining scrubbers could finally handle the load. The bioluminescent glow faded, replaced by the sterile white light of the station's internal lamps. Miller stood in the center of the chamber, his suit covered in black soot and gray ash, watching as the Holthari machinery resumed its perfect, rhythmic rotation. The Holthari were silent for a long time. They were looking at their pristine machine and seeing the scratches, the scorch marks, and the crude patches the humans had left behind. To the Holthari, it was a defilement. To Miller, it was the mark of a survivor. The payout for the job was substantial, though the Holthari delivered it with a coldness that suggested they couldn't wait for the Steadfast to leave their space. They provided the humans with refined crystals and rare earth elements that would keep the ship's reactors humming for years, but there were no words of gratitude, no recognition of the physical toll the crew had endured. As the Steadfast uncoupled from the hub and drifted into the void, Sarah joined Miller on the flight deck. She looked back at the massive station, which looked as perfect as ever from the outside. She remarked that the Holthari would probably spend the next century trying to buff out the scratches they had made. Miller laughed, a dry, raspy sound. He told her that let them buff all they wanted, as long as they could breathe while they did it. He knew that the scratches were the only reason the station was still spinning. The Steadfast turned its nose toward the next waypoint on their long, circuitous journey through the stars. They were a ship of ghosts and grease, a tiny speck of stubborn life in a galaxy that often felt like a cold, mathematical equation. They didn't have the light of the Coalition or the permanence of the Holthari, but they had something else. They had the ability to look at a broken, messy universe and decide to fix it, even if they had to get their hands dirty to do it. As the jump drive spun up, vibrating the floorboards and rattling the loose bolts in the bulkheads, Miller felt a sense of pride in their unrefined nature. They were humans, and as long as there were things that needed hitting, things that needed burning, and things that refused to work the way they were supposed to, there would always be a place for them among the stars. The transit through the void between the Holthari sovereignty and the outer reaches of the Veltoran cluster was a period of forced stillness that grated on the nerves of the crew. On the Steadfast, silence was never truly absolute. The ship breathed through the hiss of oxygen scrubbers and the rhythmic thrum of the fusion core, but the lack of an immediate crisis made the interior feel smaller than usual. The Veltoran were a species that existed in a state of constant, fluid motion, their civilization built upon orbital habitats that drifted like dandelion seeds around a dying red giant. They were masters of kinetic energy and orbital mechanics, possessing a culture that treated the conservation of momentum as a religion. To the Veltoran, stasis was death, and their architecture reflected this, with rotating rings and tethered platforms that shifted in a complex dance to maintain gravitational equilibrium. They had reached out to the humans not because of a mechanical failure or a biological infestation, but because of a problem of mass and inertia that their elegant calculations could no longer resolve. A derelict freighter from a forgotten era, a massive slab of iron and lead from some long-dead civilization, had been caught in the gravitational pull of the red giant. Its trajectory was a slow, spiraling descent that would eventually bring it into a collision course with the primary Veltoran hub, a structure housing millions of lives. The Veltoran possessed the technology to move their hub, but doing so would disrupt the delicate orbital resonance of their entire cluster, potentially sending dozens of smaller habitats careening into the sun or out into the deep void. They had tried to nudge the derelict using high-powered gravitational beams, but the ancient ship was too dense and too non-reactive. Their beams simply passed through the hull or reflected off the lead shielding without transferring enough momentum to alter its path. The Veltoran was specialized in the manipulation of energy and light. They lacked the means to apply raw, physical force to an object that refused to play by their rules of interaction. When the Steadfast arrived, the Veltoran observers were perplexed by the human vessel's lack of gravitational anchors. They watched as the Steadfast approached the derelict, a blackened hunk of metal that looked like a jagged tooth against the backdrop of the crimson sun. The Veltoran coordinator, an entity that communicated through a series of rapid light pulses translated into text, warned Miller that the derelict was emitting intense spikes of localized gravity due to its collapsing internal power core. Any ship that got too close would be caught in its wake and dragged down with it. Miller, however, was not planning on using beams or anchors. He had a different solution, one that involved the very thing the Veltoran feared: mass. He had spent the journey from Holthari space overseeing the construction of what the crew called the Anvil, a massive block of compressed scrap metal and industrial slag, reinforced with a skeleton of heavy steel girders. The plan was a primitive display of celestial billiards. The humans intended to tether the anvil to the Steadfast, accelerate to a significant fraction of their maximum thrust, and then release the mass into a direct collision with the derelict. It was a maneuver that required no elegant physics and no manipulation of fundamental forces. It was a hammer blow delivered in a vacuum. The Veltoran were horrified by the suggestion. They argued that such an impact would create a debris field that could damage their habitats, and they pointed out that the risk to the Steadfast was astronomical. If the timing was off by even a fraction of a second, the human ship would either be crushed by its own payload or pulled into the sun's gravity well. Miller responded by telling them that the debris would be easier to track than a mountain-sized freighter, and as for the risk, the humans were used to the weight of their own choices. The operation began under the watchful, terrified eyes of the Veltoran. The Steadfast strained under the weight of the anvil, its chemical engines roaring with a violence that made the hull plates scream. Sarah, acting as the navigator, had to account for the shifting center of mass as the ancient freighter's core pulsed with irregular gravitational flares. The ship was a vibrating cage of heat and noise, every bolt and weld being tested by the sheer inertia of the payload. They weren't using a computer to calculate the release. Miller was watching the telemetry on a series of flickering CRT monitors, his hands steady on the manual override. He waited until the derelict was a towering wall of black iron in their viewport, its surface pitted and scarred by eons of micrometeorite impacts. The gravitational pull of the dying sun was clawing at the Steadfast, trying to claim it. At the moment of peak velocity, Miller triggered the magnetic decouplers. The anvil lurched forward, a million tons of dead weight continuing its path as the Steadfast's retro thrusters fired with a bone-jarring jolt. The human ship peeled away, its engines glowing a frantic white as it fought the sun's grip. The collision was silent, as all things are in the void, but the visual impact was staggering. The anvil struck the derelict with the force of a small moon, the kinetic energy transferring instantly. The ancient freighter didn't shatter, it buckled. The massive slab of iron was forced off its downward spiral, its trajectory shifting by a few degrees just enough to clear the Veltoran hub by 1,000 miles. A cloud of molten metal and shattered plating erupted from the impact site, glowing briefly like a second, smaller sun before cooling into a trail of dark shards. The Steadfast drifted in the aftermath, its thrusters spent and its hull scorched by the proximity to the red giant. Inside the bridge, the crew sat in the sudden quiet, their breath hitching in the thin air. They had done it. They had moved the immovable object not with superior science, but with superior weight. The Veltoran coordinator remained silent for a long time, the light pulses from their station stuttering in a way that suggested a profound shock to their collective system. When they finally spoke, the translation was hesitant. They thanked the humans for their intervention, but noted that the method was unnecessarily physical. They couldn't understand why a species would choose to gamble their lives on a collision when a more sophisticated solution surely must have existed somewhere in the mathematics. Miller didn't bother to explain that for humans, the physical was the only thing that was truly real. The Veltoran lived in a world of variables and vectors, but humans lived in a world of consequences. They understood that sometimes the only way to stop a disaster was to hit it with something bigger. The payout from the Veltoran was a cargo of high-efficiency fuel cells and advanced kinetic dampeners, technology that would make the Steadfast faster and more stable, though it would never make it elegant. As the crew began the long process of repairing the stress fractures in the hull, they felt a familiar sense of accomplishment. They had once again proven that there was a certain power in being the galaxy's blunt instrument. They weren't the smartest, the fastest, or the most advanced, but they were the ones who showed up when the elegant solutions failed. As the Steadfast prepared to leave the Veltoran cluster, Miller looked out at the trail of debris they had left behind. The shards of the anvil and the derelict would eventually be pulled into the sun, consumed by the red giant's final gasps. It was a messy end for a messy problem. He knew that the Veltoran would likely spend generations developing new theories to explain how such a crude maneuver had succeeded where their science had failed. They would try to turn the human action into a formula, to distill the sweat and the fear and the raw mass into something they could understand. But they would never quite capture the essence of it. They would never understand the weight of unrefined iron or the stubborn spirit of the people who knew how to wield it. The ship turned away from the red sun, heading for the deep dark once more. The next job was always out there, somewhere between the stars, waiting for someone who wasn't afraid to get their hands dirty. The humans of the Steadfast were ready. They had their tools, they had their ship, and they had the knowledge that no matter how sophisticated the galaxy became, there would always be a need for someone who could deliver a hammer blow when it mattered most. They were a small flame in a vast, cold universe, but they were a flame that refused to be extinguished. And as long as they kept moving, as long as they kept hitting back against the dark, they would always have a place among the stars. The void between the Veltoran cluster and the gaseous expanses of the Uranus expanse was a graveyard of ambition, a region where the gravitational tides of three interlocking binary systems created a navigational nightmare. The Uranus were a species of atmospheric gas dwellers, translucent beings that resembled massive, drifting clouds of neon gas and electrical pulses. They lived in the upper layers of a superjovian planet, their civilization a series of floating cities held aloft by complex thermal buoyancy and magnetic levitation. They were a people of philosophy and song, their communication a literal harmony of frequencies that echoed through the dense, colorful clouds of their home. To the Uranus, physical solidity was a foreign, almost repulsive concept. They viewed the solid world as a place of stagnant, unchanging misery, far removed from the fluid grace of their aerial existence. However, the very fluidity they cherished was now being threatened by an atmospheric phenomenon that their delicate science could not contain. A localized hypercyclone fed by a runaway thermal vent from the planet's core. The vent had ruptured due to a tectonic shift deep within the metallic hydrogen layers of the planet, sending a plume of superheated gas screaming upward into the inhabited zones. This plume had created a vortex of such intensity that it was beginning to tear the floating cities from their moorings. The Uranus had tried to dissipate the vortex using harmonic resonators, attempting to cancel out the storm's energy with opposing frequencies. But the storm was too chaotic, too filled with physical debris and heavy isotopes to be calmed by mere sound. The resonators were being shattered by the sheer kinetic force of the winds, and the Uranus, who lacked any concept of physical reinforcement or rigid shielding, were helpless. They needed something solid, something heavy, and something that could withstand the crushing pressures of the lower atmosphere to plug the vent at its source. They had reached out to the humans because they had heard rumors of a species that thrived in the heavy, the solid, and the violent. The Steadfast groaned as it descended into the thick, multi-hued atmosphere of the Uranus home world. The pressure sensors were already screaming, their needles buried deep in the red zones. Human ships were built for vacuum, not for the crushing depths of a gas giant, but the Steadfast was more a collection of reinforced bulkheads than a traditional vessel. Miller had ordered the crew to weld extra support struts across the interior of the cargo bay and to double-seal the primary airlocks with industrial-grade lead bismuth alloys. As they sank deeper, the vibrant blues and purples of the upper atmosphere gave way to a murky, oppressive orange, then a bruised, lightless brown. The wind battered the hull with the force of 1,000 hammers, the sound a constant, deafening roar that made verbal communication impossible. They relied on light signals and the bone-deep vibration of the ship to understand their status. The Uranus guide, a flickering cloud of gold light contained within a pressurized glass sphere on the bridge, pulsed with frantic rhythms. It was trying to convey the location of the thermal vent, but the human instruments were struggling to make sense of the data. The magnetic field of the planet was so strong it was twisting the very light on their screens. Sarah, her face pale under the flickering emergency lights, was fighting the controls to keep the Steadfast from being flipped end over end by the turbulence. They were carrying a payload of plugs, massive cylinders of solid basalt and reinforced steel, scavenged from a mining colony in a previous sector. The plan was as crude as it was dangerous. They would dive into the eye of the vortex, match the rotational speed of the inner wall, and drop the basalt plugs directly into the vent opening. It was a feat of piloting that bordered on the suicidal. As they neared the vent, the temperature outside the hull began to spike. The reinforced armor plates of the Steadfast began to glow a dull, angry red. Inside, the heat was becoming unbearable, the air thick with the smell of scorched insulation and sweat. The crew moved like ghosts through the steam, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't wearing the lightweight suits of the Coalition. They were in heavy, liquid-cooled hardsuits that made them look like prehistoric diving bells. Miller stood at the release lever for the cargo bay doors, his boots locked into the floor. He could feel the ship buckling under the pressure, the sound of metal shearing and rivets popping like gunshots. The Uranus guide was now a dim, terrified spark, its song lost to the fury of the storm. Now, Miller signaled through the internal comms, though his voice was nothing but a rasp. Sarah threw the ship into a violent roll, using the centrifugal force to align the cargo bay with the gaping maw of the thermal vent below. The doors groaned open, fighting the external pressure that wanted to crush them inward. For a terrifying moment, the atmosphere of the gas giant tried to flood the ship, but the humans had anticipated this. They had pressurized the cargo bay with high-density inert gas to provide a counterpressure. The basalt plugs, each weighing hundreds of tons, tumbled out into the void. They fell like stones in a well, accelerated by the planet's massive gravity and the downward pull of the vortex. One by one, the sensors showed the plugs hitting their mark. The impact wasn't audible, but the ship lurched as the thermal plume was suddenly obstructed. The violent updraft that had been feeding the cyclone was cut off, replaced by a massive subterranean thud that vibrated through the Steadfast's hull. The vortex didn't disappear instantly, but its heart was gone. The chaotic winds began to lose their coherence, the tight spiral expanding and weakening. Sarah didn't wait to watch the results. She slammed the throttles forward, the fusion engines screaming as they fought to lift the battered ship out of the gravity well before the atmosphere crushed them into a pancake of scrap metal. The ascent was a blur of redouts and structural warnings. The Steadfast climbed through the layers of the atmosphere, its outer hull shedding layers of scorched plating like a molting snake. When they finally broke through the clouds into the clear, thin air of the upper reaches, the ship was a wreck. The once boxy silhouette was now warped and dented, and half the sensor arrays had been sheared off by the wind, but they were flying. Below them, the massive hypercyclone was dissipating into a series of harmless, wandering clouds. The floating cities of the Uranus were still there, their delicate moorings strained but intact. The golden light of the Uranus guide began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic glow, a song of gratitude that the humans could feel in their teeth. The Uranus provided the Steadfast with exotic gases and liquid metallic hydrogen, resources that were worth a fortune in the inner systems. But more than that, they provided a moment of profound silence. They didn't understand the humans, and they certainly didn't understand why a species would subject themselves to such physical trauma for the sake of a cargo of rocks. To the Uranus, the humans were creatures of a terrifying, heavy reality, beings that could move through the solid world with a purpose that defied the fluidity of the universe. They looked at the scarred and blackened hull of the Steadfast and saw a monument to a kind of strength they could never possess. As the crew began the arduous task of patching the hull and replacing the blown conduits, Sarah sat on the deck of the bridge, staring at her shaking hands. She asked Miller if he thought the Uranus would ever truly understand what it took to save them. Miller looked out at the vibrant, swirling clouds of the planet they were leaving behind. He told her that it didn't matter if they understood. The Uranus were made of light and song, and the galaxy needed that. But the galaxy also needed the people who weren't afraid to be heavy. It needed the people who could carry the weight that everyone else was trying to float away from. The Steadfast, with its dented plates and its unrefined iron, was the only reason the song was still playing. The jump drive engaged with its usual bone-shaking rattle, and the Uranus world vanished into the rear view. They were heading further out now, toward the edge of the charted sectors where the light of civilization grew thin. The crew was tired, the ship was bruised, and the universe remained as indifferent as ever. But as Miller looked at the manifest of their new resources, he knew they would keep going. They were humans, the specialists in the impossible, the dirty, and the heavy. And as long as there were storms to be plugged and weights to be moved, the Steadfast would be there, a crude and beautiful reminder that sometimes the only way to save the light is to stand firmly in the dark. The fringe of the charted galaxy was a place where the laws of physics seemed to fray at the edges, a region known as the fracture where the density of spacetime was inconsistent and unpredictable. The Steadfast moved through this distorted terrain with the cautious gait of a blind man in a minefield. The hull groaned under the influence of localized gravity shears that could stretch a ship like taffy or compress it into a singularity without a moment's warning. The inhabitants of this region were not a single species, but a desperate collection of outcasts and refugees known as the scavenger convergence. They were a people who lived in the hollowed-out husks of dead moons and the rusted remains of dreadnoughts from wars that had occurred before the coalition had even learned to walk upright. The scavengers were masters of improvisation, but they were currently facing a threat that no amount of jury-rigging could fix. A localized collapse of the spatial fabric that was slowly devouring their primary habitat, a massive station built inside the core of a dormant neutron star. The station, referred to as the Iron Heart, was the only thing keeping the scavenger convergence from being scattered to the winds of the void. It provided the magnetic shielding necessary to survive the intense radiation of the fracture, and its massive geothermal taps provided the power for their life support systems. However, the spatial collapse, a rift in the very continuity of the universe, was drawing closer to the station's core every day. The scavengers had tried to use their warp disruptors to push the rift away, but the rift consumed the energy and grew larger. They had tried to evacuate, but their fleet of patchwork ships lacked the structural integrity to carry the millions of inhabitants through the gravity shears of the fracture. They were trapped in a shrinking pocket of reality, waiting for the moment when the Iron Heart would be turned inside out. They had called for the Steadfast because they knew that humans were the only ones crazy enough to operate in high-gravity environments without the use of inertial compensators. Miller stood on the bridge of the Steadfast, his eyes fixed on the sensor ghost that represented the rift. It was a hole in the universe, a blacker-than-black void that distorted the stars behind it into grotesque, elongated shapes. The human ship was currently docked with the Iron Heart, its docking clamps vibrating with the resonance of the dying station. The scavenger leader, a being whose body was a patchwork of cybernetic limbs and organic grafts from 4 different species, met Miller in the airlock. The leader, who called itself Vaughn, spoke through a mechanical vocoder that crackled with static. Vaughn explained that the only way to stop the collapse was to trigger a massive, localized explosion of kinetic energy directly inside the rift to cauterize the spatial wound. But the explosion had to be physical. Any energy-based weapon would simply be absorbed by the rift's hunger. They needed a mass driver of unprecedented scale, and they needed it delivered with a precision that their failing systems could no longer provide. The humans had a plan, but it was one that made even the battle-hardened scavengers flinch. The Steadfast was carrying a remaining stockpile of hyperdense tungsten rods, originally intended for orbital bombardment. Miller proposed to use the ship itself as the barrel of a makeshift railgun. They would vent the atmosphere from the central corridor, line the walls with the magnetic coils from their own sublight engines, and fire the rods at a significant fraction of light speed, while the ship was in a dive toward the event horizon of the rift. It was a one-way trip for the equipment and a near-certain death sentence for the ship's propulsion systems. If they succeeded, the kinetic impact would create a shockwave in the spatial fabric that would seal the rift. If they failed, they would be the first things consumed by the collapse. The preparation was a fever dream of activity. The crew of the Steadfast worked alongside the scavengers, stripping the human ship of its comforts to provide the raw materials for the railgun. They tore out the flooring of the main deck to expose the power conduits, and they bypassed the safety limiters on the fusion core until the entire vessel hummed with a dangerous, ionizing energy. Sarah worked in the engine room, her hands covered in grease and cooling fluid as she rerouted the plasma flows. She knew that once they fired the rods, the Steadfast would be little more than a drifting hulk, its engines burnt out by the massive power draw. But there was no other choice. The Iron Heart was already beginning to buckle, its internal gravity generators failing as the rift drew closer. As the Steadfast detached from the station and began its final approach, the reality around them started to dissolve. The walls of the bridge seemed to ripple, and the clocks began to run at different speeds in different parts of the room. Miller sat in the pilot's chair, his teeth gritted against the nausea of spatial distortion. He could feel the rift pulling at his very atoms, a cold, hungry sensation that defied description. They were diving into the throat of a god, and all they had was a handful of metal rods and the stubbornness of a species that refused to blink. The sensors were useless now. The monitors showed nothing but static and flickering patterns of impossible colors. Miller relied on his gut and the rhythmic thud of the cooling pumps to time the shot. "Charge the coils," Miller shouted, his voice sounding hollow in the thin, recycled air. Sarah slammed the final breakers home. The Steadfast lurched as the magnetic fields engaged, the ship's frame screaming in protest as it was transformed into a weapon. The tungsten rods were loaded into the central corridor, held in place by flickering blue arcs of electricity. The rift loomed ahead, a terrifying absence of everything. It wasn't a wall or a hole, it was an end. At the moment of maximum acceleration, Miller triggered the release. The Steadfast was thrown backward by the recoil, the internal struts snapping like toothpicks. The tungsten rods vanished into the rift, moving so fast they were invisible to the naked eye. The impact was not a sound, but a shudder that felt like it was happening to the soul of every person on board. For a moment, the rift flared with a brilliant, blinding white light, the color of physics being forced back into its proper shape. The shockwave hit the Steadfast like a physical blow, tumbling the ship through the chaotic space. Systems failed one by one, the lights flickered and died, the gravity plates went cold, and the hiss of escaping air filled the corridors. But when the light faded and the sensors slowly rebooted, the rift was gone. The spatial collapse had been halted, the wound in reality stitched shut by the sheer kinetic violence of the human intervention. The Iron Heart was safe, its magnetic shielding holding firm against the radiation of the fracture. The Steadfast was a wreck. It drifted in the dark, its engines cold and its hull riddled with micro cracks from the stress of the railgun fire. Inside, the crew worked by the light of emergency glow sticks, their breath frosting in the rapidly cooling air. They had saved millions of lives, but they were now stranded in the most dangerous region of the galaxy with no way to get home. However, the scavengers did not leave them to rot. Within hours, a fleet of patchwork ships descended upon the Steadfast, not to salvage it, but to save it. They used their own tractor beams to stabilize the human vessel and began a massive, collaborative effort to repair the damage. They brought components from a dozen different civilizations, welding Vexian plating onto human bulkheads and replacing the burnt-out fusion coils with Holthari power crystals. As the Steadfast was towed back toward the Iron Heart, Miller stood on the bridge, watching the scavenger ships work. He realized that for the first time, the humans were not just the hired help. They were the reason this corner of the galaxy was still standing. The scavengers honored them not with medals or speeches, but with the one thing that mattered in the fracture: resources. They provided the Steadfast with the best of their scavenged technology, turning the battered freighter into something more, a hybrid of a dozen different cultures, all held together by the unyielding iron of its human core. Vaughn, the scavenger leader, contacted Miller one last time, his vocoder sounding almost clear. He told Miller that the galaxy was a broken place, but as long as there were humans, the pieces might just stay together. The repairs took weeks, but when the Steadfast finally powered up its new, hybrid engines, it felt stronger than it ever had. It was no longer just a relic of Earth. It was a testament to the resilience of life in the face of the void. The crew had survived the heart of a spatial collapse, and they had come out the other side with a ship that was as much a part of the galaxy as the stars themselves. As they prepared to make the jump out of the fracture, Miller looked at his crew. They were tired, scarred, and far from home, but they were alive. They had proven that even in a universe of light and exotic matter, there was a fundamental power in the physical, the heavy, and the unrefined. They were the ones who held the line when reality itself began to fail. The Steadfast turned its nose toward the final waypoint of their journey, a destination that lay beyond the known sectors. There was one last job to do, one final weight to carry. The galaxy was still a messy, dangerous place, but the humans of the Steadfast were no longer afraid of the dark. They knew the weight of their own iron, and they knew that as long as they kept moving, there was nothing in the universe they couldn't hit back. The jump drive engaged, a smooth, powerful hum that spoke of the new strength within the ship's bones, and the Steadfast vanished into the stars, a ghost of the old world leading the way into the new. The final leg of the journey took the Steadfast beyond the reach of the fracture, past the last flickering beacons of the scavenger convergence, and into the silent expanse. This was a region of space so ancient and so empty that even the light from the galactic core seemed to struggle to penetrate the gloom. At the center of this emptiness sat the archive of the First, a structure that predated the Coalition, the Holthari, and perhaps even the stars themselves. It was a massive sphere of absolute blackness, a moon-sized construct that absorbed all radiation and emitted nothing. The archive was said to contain the sum total of all knowledge from the civilizations that had existed before the current cycle of the universe, a treasure trove of science and history that could elevate any species to the status of gods. However, the archive was not a library that could be browsed. It was a vault that had remained sealed for billions of years, protected by a gravitational lock that required a specific physical resonance to open. The Coalition had spent centuries trying to crack the archive using their most advanced harmonic lasers and multidimensional probes. They had failed because they were looking for a digital key or a mathematical sequence. They assumed that the creators of the archive were as obsessed with elegance as they were. The Holthari had tried to use their geometric perfection to calculate the exact pressure points of the sphere, but their machines had shattered against the archive's surface, which was harder than any material known to modern science. Even the Oranis had tried to sing to the vault, hoping that their frequencies would find a sympathetic vibration in the dark. All had failed because the archive was not protected by a code or a lock. It was protected by the weight of time itself. To open it, one did not need to be clever, fast, or musical. One needed to be heavy. One needed to provide the literal, physical counterweight to the archive's internal pressure. The Steadfast approached the archive, its new hybrid engines purring with a mixture of human grit and alien sophistication. Miller looked at the black sphere on his primary screen. It was an object of terrifying simplicity. There were no ports, no antennas, and no visible seams. It was just a void in the shape of a world. The human ship was here because the Coalition, in a rare moment of humility, had realized that their light was too thin for this task. They had contacted Miller through a series of intermediaries, offering a reward that would allow every member of the crew to retire in luxury for 1,000 lifetimes. But Miller wasn't doing it for the credits. He was doing it because the archive represented the ultimate challenge for a species built on the principle of hitting things until they worked. He wanted to know if human iron could move the foundation of the universe. The plan was for the Steadfast to dock with a specific coordinate on the sphere's surface, a point identified by the scavengers as a pressure relief valve for the archive's internal gravitational core. Once attached, the humans would use their modified fusion reactors to generate a localized gravitational field of such extreme density that it would trick the archive into thinking it was under the weight of a collapsing star. This would trigger a safety protocol that would cause the archive to vent its internal pressure, momentarily opening a physical breach in the hull. The danger was that the Steadfast would be at the epicenter of this gravitational event. The ship would be squeezed between the archive's immovable mass and its own artificial gravity, a situation that would likely turn the vessel and its crew into a microscopic speck of lead if the timing was off by even a microsecond. Sarah sat at the helm, her fingers dancing across a control panel that was now a chaotic mix of copper wiring, crystalline displays, and glowing neon tubes. She had spent the last week calibrating the gravitational generators, a task that had required her to invent an entirely new branch of dirty physics that the Coalition would have considered heresy. She wasn't trying to harmonize with the archive, she was trying to bully it. Beside her, the other crew members were secured in high-pressure acceleration couches, their bodies encased in suits that were more like individual armored vehicles. The air on the bridge was cold and thin, the life support systems struggling to keep up with the massive power draw of the gravity coils. Miller watched the distance count down on his HUD. He felt a strange sense of calm. This was what humans did best. They stood in the path of the impossible and refused to move. "Engage magnetic clamps," Miller ordered. The Steadfast shuddered as it made contact with the archive. There were no sparks, no grinding of metal. The black surface simply accepted the ship's anchors as if they were part of itself. Immediately, the gravitational pull of the sphere began to claw at the Steadfast. The hull plates groaned, and the internal lights flickered between a sickly yellow and a deep, bruised purple. Sarah initiated the gravity sequence. The ship's fusion core roared, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly in the marrow of their bones. The artificial gravity field flared to life, creating a pocket of hyperdensity that warped the very light inside the bridge. For a moment, Miller felt like he was being crushed by the weight of a mountain. He couldn't breathe, his vision blurred, and the sound of the ship screaming in agony was the only thing he could hear. The archive responded. The black surface beneath the Steadfast didn't shatter, it flowed. A massive, circular section of the sphere began to sink inward, releasing a plume of exotic particles that glowed with a color that didn't exist in the visible spectrum. This was the breath of the first, the ancient energy that had been locked away since the beginning of time. The Steadfast was caught in the middle of this discharge, the ship being tossed like a leaf in a hurricane. But the anchors held. The unrefined iron of the human ship, reinforced by the scavenged technology of a dozen races, refused to break. The breach opened wider, revealing a corridor of pure white light that led into the heart of the archive. Miller, fighting against the crushing G-forces, signaled the deployment of the probe, a hardened, lead-shielded canister containing a high-speed data thief. The data thief vanished into the white light, its sensors gorging themselves on the wisdom of eons. For 60 seconds, the Steadfast stood at the doorway of the gods, acting as the physical wedge that kept the universe's greatest secret from closing its eyes. Then, the archive's internal sensors realized the intrusion. The gravitational pressure shifted, the sphere attempting to crush the Steadfast out of existence. Miller saw the warning lights on his console turn a solid, terminal red. "Release anchors, full reverse," he croaked. Sarah didn't need to be told. She slammed the emergency release, and the Steadfast was propelled away from the archive by the force of the venting gases. The breach snapped shut behind them with a silent, spatial concussion that sent a shockwave through the silent expanse. The Steadfast tumbled through the void, its engines dead and its hull scorched by the exotic radiation. But as the ship slowly stabilized, the primary computer chirped a successful download notification. They had it. They had the archive's data. They had the maps of the prestellar civilizations, the formulas for vacuum energy, and the history of 1 billion years. Miller sat back in his chair, his chest heaving as he tried to pull air into his bruised lungs. He looked at Sarah, who was slumped over her console, her eyes closed but her thumb still pressing the safe button. They were alive. They had gone to the edge of the universe, challenged the oldest thing in existence, and walked away with its treasure. The return journey was a victory lap across the galaxy. As news of their success spread, the Coalition, the Holthari, and the Oranis sent fleets to escort the Steadfast home. The humans were no longer seen as the crude laborers or the messy specialists. They were the keepers of the archive. The data they had recovered would change everything, providing the keys to a future where scarcity and war might finally become relics of the past. But as the Steadfast finally docked at the high-orbit station above Earth, Miller realized that the technology wasn't the most important thing they had brought back. The most important thing was the proof that the universe, for all its elegance and its light, still needed the heavy. It still needed the people who weren't afraid of the weight, the people who could provide the friction that made progress possible. The Steadfast was retired after that mission, placed in a museum that was built around it in the heart of the lunar colonies. People from across the galaxy came to see it, to run their hands over the dented armor plating and the scorched hull. They looked at the exposed wiring and the crude, manual levers and wondered how such a primitive thing could have opened the archive. Miller often visited the ship, sitting in his old pilot's chair and listening to the silence of the museum. He knew the answer. It wasn't about the technology, it was about the iron. It was about the stubborn, unrefined spirit of a species that looked at a closed door and decided to kick it down. He knew that the galaxy would continue to grow and change, and that one day, even the knowledge of the archive would become obsolete. But Miller wasn't worried about the future. He knew that as long as there were humans, there would be someone ready to pick up a hammer when the elegant solutions failed. He knew that the weight of the universe would always be there, and there would always be a need for someone with the strength to carry it. As he walked out of the museum for the last time, leaving the Steadfast to its well-earned rest, he looked up at the stars. They seemed a little brighter now, a little less indifferent. The galaxy was a big, messy, beautiful place, and for the first time in history, humanity was truly at home in it. They had earned their place not through perfection, but through the enduring power of unrefined iron.